You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. In today's episode, John is joined by Dr. Janusz Petkowski. Dr. Petkowski is a research scientist at the MIT EAPS Department Earth, Atmospheric and Planetary Science. Dr. Petkowski's research is focused on finding life on exoplanets, biosignature gases, and theoretical biochemistry. He is a co-author on the 2 papers detailing the discovery of phosphine gas in the cloud decks of Venus, as well as determining that the phosphine on Venus cannot be explained by conventional processes.
Dr. Janusz Petkowski, welcome back to the program.
It's great to be back.
Now, Doctor, sulfuric acid as a solvent for life, that maybe that liquid that we thought might have been, at least at one time, might have been the most unlikely of solvents where the chemistry of life could have occurred, now seems to actually be on the table as an alternative to water. Now, these alternatives to water, there are a number of liquids that can exist in the universe at the right temperatures. And maybe we are anthropocentric in our thinking regarding solvents of life, and that maybe there is life out there that exists in sulfuric acid. Can you give us an overview of that idea?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I agree completely. And I would actually go further. And I would say that we are not only anthropocentric in our view, but we are terracentric in our view. When we look for life on another planet, we often use the template of our own life and our own biochemistry that we have here on Earth in water and try to apply the same template and the same rules of biochemistry and chemistry to other bodies in our own solar system. And this is clear that it is not going to work because our life, our biochemistry is a direct consequence of our specific environment on our planet, which is essentially an environment where the dominant liquid is water. Even in our own solar system, of course, we have other places where we expect liquid water to exist. For example, under the ice shells of Jupiter's moons, like Europa, for example, or even further under the ice shell of Enceladus, the moon of Saturn, or even further into the Kuiper belt, maybe even under the dwarf planet Pluto and beyond. So water, clearly liquid water, is a relatively common environment. And of course, as we will learn also maybe during this interview, but not all water is also equal, yes, because it might actually have additional components that change the conditions there quite significantly and force this chemistry of life to be significantly different. But water is not the only liquid or not the only solvent that is present on different places on planets and moons in our own solar system. And we can actually embark on a journey through our solar system and talk a little bit and look at these different liquids and different solvents as we go further into the void. And we can start from Venus, because Venus is my favorite planet. It's a really remarkable world that has a lot of mysteries. And most of those mysteries are actually present or associated with the clouds. And the clouds of Venus are completely different than clouds on Earth. They might look similar from at the first glance, but the main liquid that forms clouds of Venus is actually a concentrated sulfuric acid. It's not liquid water, so the clouds are not made from little droplets of liquid water, but actually from little droplets of concentrated sulfuric acid. There is almost no water whatsoever on Venus, and Venus is famously water scarce. But this doesn't mean that these liquid droplets of concentrated sulfuric acid are actually completely sterile to chemistry or any interesting chemistry, because our recent various experiments also done by Dr. Jan Spacek and Professor Steve Benner, as well as our group, actually suggest that a very interesting organic chemistry can happen in this unforgiving environment. And we call this environment unforgiving because it is actually completely incompatible with our own biochemistry, our own life. So no matter what, our life, even the most hardy extremophiles that we have here on Earth or acidophiles that we have on Earth, cannot really survive in the clouds of Venus, and they cannot live there. So if indeed something lives in the clouds of Venus, and it has to use a completely different biochemistry or completely different adaptations than we have here on Earth. And we might think that, that sulfuric acid is actually something of an of a rare and esoteric substance or liquid. But it is also might not be the case. It might actually be one of the most common liquids in the galaxy. Not only in our own solar system, we have this one planet example, Venus, where this liquid actually is present in significant amounts. But there were other studies by, for example, Professor Ballesteros that suggest that sulfuric acid as a planetary liquid could actually be very common on various exoplanets that are a little bit more inward to the canonical habitable zone. So there are planets where liquid water is not really present, but still they are actually cold enough to have this, or I would say, to have liquid sulfuric acid as a solvent. So liquid sulfuric acid might actually be one of the most common liquids in the galaxy in general. And if indeed this is actually so common, then studying the organic chemistry and what reactions actually could happen in sulfuric acid, and can they lead, for example, to formation of various polymers that could carry information and could be considered a genetic polymer, and hence maybe a basis for life, is actually quite important and paramount in this research, very novel research on the possibility of existence of life in alternative solvents.
What of oxygen? So say you have a sulfuric acid-based, solvent-based life, okay? Does it go through the same evolutionary history as water-based life? In other words, does it photosynthesize first, and can it produce an intelligent being eventually? An alien that you could interact with probably wouldn't want to shake hands with it, given that it's sulfuric acid. But at the same time, are the options of eventual intelligent life and civilization possible with a life form based on sulfuric acid?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because if there is life on Venus, then it's most likely some sort of microbial life. So we are not going to have complex multicellular organisms in the clouds, of course. But we, of course, do not know if there is anything living in the clouds, but we hope to actually go there and study this problem, and relatively soon, might I add. But life in other solvents, and specifically in sulfuric acid, actually evolve into something more complex than a single cell or even more primitive organisms. This would require this concentrated sulfuric acid to be somehow present on the surface of the planet. Because, for example, if we have a situation when the planet actually has this cloud habitat, and only the cloud habitat as we have on Venus, then the liquid droplets are actually a limitation in real estate, so to speak. So if we live inside of such a liquid droplet, then we eventually are short on space. So we would not expect complex organisms to also evolve there, because there is sort of an evolutionary pressure to become small instead of large. But if we, and this is a big if, because we don't really know that, can we actually have a planet that is a little bit further away from the sun, from the central star, in a way that this sulfuric acid can rain out on the surface and become sort of a surface liquid, then maybe this actually would be more stable and more welcoming habitat for some sort of evolution of more complex beings. This is, of course, a highly speculative idea, because even if the theoretical predictions of Professor Ballesteros suggest that sulfuric acid is actually a very common liquid on exoplanets, we cannot automatically assume that concentrated sulfuric acid can form seas, stable seas and oceans on the surface of such planets. So if we, for example, have a situation where we can have like a planet like Earth, but with sulfuric acid ocean or a sea, we don't know if this is possible, because we don't know if we can have a nice geological cycle where sulfuric acid plays the same role as water. And because this is unknown, we don't know how stable such potential reservoirs of concentrated sulfuric acid, seas and oceans, could be on the surface. But if they are stable, and if we can have a planet with stable oceans of sulfuric acid or seas or some sort of larger reservoirs, then there is no inherent limitation for life to evolve into something that is larger or more complex and multicellular. And then we can ask ourselves a question: is this life going to actually evolve the same solutions to the same problems that water life actually has or evolved? And we can cautiously answer this question with a yes. And why is so? Is because essentially sulfuric acid forces us to change our chemistry, so we have to use a different chemistry So we cannot use, for example, proteins as our executive branch of biochemistry. We have to have a completely different genetic polymer, different cell membranes to make a cellular structure. But this doesn't mean that we cannot form such structures. It only means that we actually have to use different organic building blocks, like different Lego, to build the same solutions. So, for example, one of my friends, Dr. Daniel Dustevich from Professor Jack Szostak lab, was able to form little vesicles with special lipids in concentrated sulfuric acid. And these vesicles behave analogously to vesicles in water. So basically, you just use different Legos, different building blocks of organic material, and you can arrive at the same evolutionary solutions, so to speak. So we could cautiously answer this question as a yes. We can say that eventually life would find a solution that is analogous to what we have here in water. But this life will be built from a completely different building blocks. And this also applies to such profound evolutionary inventions, like, for example, photosynthesis. Fixation of carbon is something that is universal, or that has to be a no-brainer for any type of life, no matter its chemical makeup. It's always going to be beneficial. And having a highly oxidized waste product is always going to be also quite a nice idea to have. So it might actually arrive at the same solutions, but through very different routes, or through the very different chemical routes. And of course, there is a ever-present question: is the origin of life in a different solvent than water even possible? And we, of course, don't know the answer to that question. We cannot say definitely not, and we cannot say yes. We cannot even solve really the origin of life of our. We do not know yet how life originated in our own planet, in water, after more or less 100 years of research. So the question if life can originate in such a completely different solvent like sulfuric acid or concentrated sulfuric acid, well, still open, and we still don't know. But we cannot a priori assume that it is actually impossible.
Now, changing planets, and we know that Venus changed over the course of its history. It might have once been a water world and then became a sulfuric acid world as far as solvents go. So can it be imagined that life can make a switch between solvents? In other words, it appears in water, and then as a planet changes, evolutionary pressure forces it to become dependent on a different solvent, sulfuric acid. Can we go that far to imagine that?
And again, the answer to this question would be we have no idea. And the reason why we have no idea is because we have absolutely no precedent of such an event, such an evolutionary event here on Earth. And the reason why we don't have such an evolutionary precedent on Earth for a solvent replacement, so to speak, is that our life never had to face such a challenge. At the first glance, we might think that this is a complete science fiction to replace one's life solvent from water to sulfuric acid. I mean, and actually, if you were to make such a case that this is a science fiction, you might be actually right, because most of our biochemicals, as we mentioned, are completely unstable in concentrated sulfuric acid. So if we cannot transfer our own water biochemistry to concentrated sulfuric acid. A lot of our biochemicals will fall apart, starting from our own DNA and our own, for example, ribose linker in our nucleotides. So we cannot really do that at the first glance. But are we really sure? But can we really exclude such a possibility? Maybe not directly replacing. For example, we can speculate a little bit that if such a change from water environment to sulfuric acid environment really happened, then maybe life actually replaced its solvent, but didn't replace its water solvent, not with sulfuric acid, but maybe with something that it makes as a substitute of water or for an interior of its cell. So we do not necessarily have to have an watery interior of a cell in principle, but if we make some other medium in which all the biochemistry happens, that it's not sulfuric acid, but it's a later evolutionary invention, then maybe this can happen. This is, of course, again, something that we do not have a precedent here on Earth, but who knows? We cannot exclude that this is actually completely impossible. Then, of course, this is not a problem if life actually can originate in concentrated sulfuric acid, because if it can originate in concentrated sulfuric acid, then a solvent replacement is actually not a problem. And of course, if there is something like life in the clouds of Venus, then it might also be that this life simply clings to water as much as it can and just has unbelievably efficient ways of adaptation to that environment and water retention, for example, or even maybe water production that we simply do not have an example on Earth. And its solvent is still its reliance on water. It's a relic of the ancient past where this planet was actually habitable from the canonical point of view. So it had liquid water on the surface.
Is it a viable solution to the Fermi paradox that changing planets is what keeps life simple? In other words, the only thing that can adapt to these kinds of changes from changing solvents can only happen to microbial life, and that humans and dinosaurs are entirely dependent on the stability of a planet, which might be rare.
It is possible. There is this very open question in general in evolution of complex life. Do we actually need oxygen to get complex life? And why am I actually asking this question? Is because we can say that the great oxygenation event approximately 2.5 billion years ago was extremely tragic event for the entire biosphere. Yes, essentially for any anoxic life that was living freely on the surface of the planet. This was actually a tremendously stressful environment that eventually led to a global extinction of almost entire biosphere that did not manage to adapt to this completely new environment. Of course, I do not want to equate the great oxygenation event to a change of an environment where water disappears, of course. But it was a dramatic event in the history of our planet, and a lot of organisms did not manage to adapt to it. But we are descendants of those organisms that actually did survive and did adapt to it. And we achieved tremendously awesome things. And we can say, of course, humbly, but we can say that we are at the peak of the evolutionary race right now, as everybody else who is alive today.
Looking for life at Venus. Now, let's check in as per our previous conversation. Where are we at as far as sending a private mission to Venus to specifically look for life?
So we are part of the consortium. We are actually partnering also with the private company Rocket Lab, and we hope to actually send a small probe to Venus, where we actually look for something very new. So we ask a question that was never asked before, and no probe before was actually trying to find it. We are trying to find signs of organic molecules and organic chemistry in the clouds of Venus. So we have a very small probe that actually is capable, has a very novel instrument that is developed by the group of the Dr. Darrell Baumgartner, and it's called an autofluorescent nephelometer. And this autofluorescent nephelometer is capable of not only finding out what are the sizes and shapes of cloud particles in the clouds, but also try to find out what is their actual composition. And the fluorescence component is capable of maybe detecting actually the organic chemicals within the cloud particles. So we are going to be able to with a very small mission in scope, answer one of the very profound questions about the habitability of the clouds. Not only what are the shapes and sizes of the molecules of the cloud particles, but also is there actually organic chemistry in the clouds in relatively large quantities? Because we know that, of course, organic chemistry is not necessarily life. So this is not a mission that is going to give us a smoking gun. Oh yes, there is something alive in the clouds of Venus, but it's going to give us a very interesting results, because we know that there is no life without organic chemistry. So any kind of detection of organic chemistry and hopefully follow-up missions are going to also ask a question, not only if there is organic chemistry in the clouds, but also what are those organic molecules there. So these are our plans. Currently, the Rocket Lab mission is on schedule to be launched in January 2025. So we hope to actually bring very interesting results to the broad scientific community and finally study these mysterious clouds of Venus that are actually so difficult to study because of course, this very alien and very unforgiving environment.
Yeah, but that makes it interesting because it is an alien environment, yet maybe it could be supporting microbial life in its upper atmosphere. If we found evidence of microbial life in Venus's atmosphere, would that be enough to be able to say that the universe must teem with life at its simplest level? Maybe not evolution and dinosaurs again, but could we say if we found it there that it was entirely independent chemically from life on Earth, no panspermia here, could we then say life must be everywhere?
Yes, then we can actually put this hypothesis forward that indeed life is a common occurrence, or maybe even a direct consequence of the existence of the universe or the laws of physics. And why is that? If we actually have a life that is living in a solvent that is completely different than water and has a completely different biochemistry that cannot possibly have common origin with our own life here on Earth, then we know that there are at least two different chemical paths for life's origin. And if there are two different chemical paths for life's origin, then this tremendously increases the probability of life in the universe or in the galaxy in general. And not only because it also increases the real estate of exoplanets. We can not only look for planets that contain liquid water on the surface, but we also can focus on planets that can possibly have or host these other solvents, like, for example, concentrated sulfuric acid. And who knows, maybe this concentrated sulfuric acid, as Professor Ballesteros suggests, is actually one of the most common liquids in the universe. So there is quite of a possibility that indeed life is a common feature of the universe. And if it can exist in different solvents, then that essentially makes life almost an inevitable consequence of existence of the universe.
There's solvents. Now, we also have some elephants in the room. We have a moon, Titan, that has very low temperature liquids, hydrocarbons. And we also have the option of ammonia. So if we were to find life in sulfuric acid based on that solvent, does that increase the prospects for those two other seemingly nice chemicals for the chemistry of life to occur? So in other words, does that make it more likely that we might find low temperature microbes on Titan?
So that's a very, very interesting question, because paradoxically speaking, from the temperature point of view, sulfuric acid and water are quite similar to each other. They both can be called hot solvents. Yes, they are liquid at hotter temperatures. Like, for example, water is liquid at regular 1 atmosphere pressures between 0 and 100 Celsius degrees. Sulfuric acid is liquid, pure sulfuric acid is liquid between, let's say, 10 Celsius degrees to 360, or maybe even higher than that. So these are all conditions, in temperature conditions, which we can call hot. On the other side of the solar system, we have environments where the liquids that are present there, like, for example, on the surface of Saturn, Moon's Titan, all of those liquids are actually liquid at the very low temperatures. And what is the problem with low temperature solvents, like, for example, liquid methane, that is really, really cold, is that the solubility of molecules in such conditions in such low temperature conditions is very low in general. So we have to imagine that for life to exist, it has to have this liquid. And this is because it has to have these large molecules that life actually uses to exist. They need to be soluble in this environment, in this solvent. And the solubility allows these molecules to actually find each other in this environment, in the liquid environment, and interact, and for the chemistry to actually happen. If you have problems with solubility, if almost nothing is soluble at these very low temperatures, then you might have a problem with actually running biochemistry. Because we have to be aware that in our cells, even very large polymers, like, for example, some proteins, some very large proteins, are still soluble in water. We cannot even hope that such large polymers will be soluble at such low temperatures. Now, can life overcome the solubility problem of these cryosolvents, of these low temperature solvents? The answer to that question is actually we don't know. But I think that from that point of view, from the solubility limitation, is actually the most difficult problem for life to circumvent or to solve. Not reactivity. People often say that at low temperatures, the reactivity of molecules will also be lower, which might actually be positive, because from some point of view, it might be positive because some of the molecules might be more stable. Some other molecules that are too reactive at high temperatures might actually be reactive just right for some special biochemical reaction. So reactivity of various molecules can always be tailored to the solvent, but the solubility limitation is something that appears to be impossible to overcome. But who knows? Maybe life actually found a way around that. From that point of view, I think that if you have a hotter solvent, but not too hot because you cannot break your molecules into tiny gaseous molecules, you need these molecules to be stable. for example, large polymers to be stable. From that point of view, I think that the hotter solvents like water and sulfuric acid are actually much more promising for complex biochemistry from these solubility reasons.
Back to the Venus Lifefinder mission and related ideas. Now, can that be applied once that's done and the privatization of the search for life in the solar system other than Earth is in full swing? Can that be applied, a similar idea be applied to Mars and, for that matter, Titan, or even sampling the plumes of Enceladus or Europa? Can we envision being able to do all of that privately? Because with government, with NASA, there are concerns in politics and all these sorts of things that intervene in being able to do direct detection experiments with life, because you're spending a whole lot of money. But privately, you're not. It's much less. So can you envision being able to build upon the Venus Lifefinder mission should it be successful?
I hope so. I really hope so. And so the Rocket Lab mission that we hope to have in January 2025, the launch of that, we hope this to be just the first mission in the series of small focused missions to Venus. And our initiative that is now called that used to be called the Venus Lifefinder. Now we call it the Morningstar missions to Venus. It's actually this series of missions that we hope to send that follow up the first mission in the series that is the Rocket Lab mission to Venus. Now, if this model is actually successful, then it means that you can actually have a very nimble and fast and also very scientifically impactful private missions that can actually bring a very profound scientific discoveries. Like, for example, the Rocket Lab mission to Venus, as I mentioned, is really trying to have a very focused scientific objective, which is to study the clouds of Venus, to study the particles of the clouds, and to detect organic chemistry and check if there is organic chemistry there. Nobody before tried this. And if indeed the organic chemistry is there, this would be a profound game-changing event. And of course you can, and indeed we hope to apply this not only through the series of missions to Venus under the Morningstar missions or VLF umbrella, but also beyond that. And there is also an initiative that is called Alpha Mars, led by my friend Dr. Janusz Petkowski, who is trying to sort of build on that experiences of the Morningstar missions and also the Rocket Lab mission to Venus. Let's also try to do this for Mars and detect life or life's genetic polymers directly there on Mars. And it has wonderful instruments that are specifically tailored for such detection as well. So this is basically an instrument that is capable of detecting any kind of genetic polymer that has a charged backbone. So we will be able to have a true life detection instrument in that sense. And maybe this is a bit of a stretch, but this is sort of a Star Trek tricorder 1.0 life science detector. But this is, of course, with a little bit of a humorous note. But such initiatives, I hope that this would lead to more of such missions that are more focused and that have this astrobiology at the very center of its scientific objectives. Because we really, to find life elsewhere in our solar system, we just have to try to start to look for it. Because if we actually do not look for life there specifically with targeted missions that have astrobiology at its center, then the probability that we are actually going to find it, or at least bring some evidence of life elsewhere, well, are really low.
Extending out, does this work and exploring the idea of detecting life remotely from orbit of a planet, does this ultimately translate to astrobiology in general, exoplanets? Does this lead to eventually to thinking about what remote signatures can we look for at a distance? We know about oxygen and methane and all those things, but one of the problems there is ambiguity. So if we look at exoplanets, could this work? And looking at alternative chemistry lead to things that we could look for that would be proof of a biosphere on an exoplanet?
So a question, can we actually get a proof, is a very difficult one, because we will never get a proof of life on an exoplanet. And the reason for it is because we are unfortunately only able to look at the constituents at best at the constituents of the atmosphere, gaseous constituents of the atmosphere of exoplanets. So we only will be able to detect, if we are lucky, we will be able to detect some gases that do not belong in the atmosphere of exoplanet far, far away. But we will not know anything else about this planet, maybe outside of the general size and mass of the planet. So we will not, for example, know the exact geological context of this planet. So we will not know if this, for example, weird gas that we detected, hypothetically, is not a product of some weird geologic or photochemical process in this alien exoplanet atmosphere, and that has nothing to do with life. So from that point of view, it will be very difficult to actually get a proof that we've detected life. And this is also a problem for our own solar system, because in the solar system, we can detect various gases in various different atmospheres, like, for example, in Mars or Venus or elsewhere. But at least in our own solar system, we can go there and try to study it further and study the planet itself, study the geological context in which these gases are produced. Like, for example, this brings us back to the detection of phosphine in the Venusian atmosphere or to the detection of methane on Mars. We still argue what this means. Are the detections real? Are they not real? Where those gases were detected, at how high in the atmosphere, and so on. But at least these type of arguments and these type of scientific debates can be solved, because we can actually go to Mars, we can actually go to Venus and look at this further. We do not have that luxury with exoplanets. The ultimate proof that we have life in our own solar system, we can only probably get with very sophisticated instruments that are not really ready yet, and probably through sample return missions. Because we have to realize that we have really great machinery here on Earth, in Earth's laboratories. So if we actually bring the sample here on Earth and to Earth and study this in our own laboratories, then we have actually a chance to prove that life is indeed somewhere else on an alien planet, for example, in the clouds of Venus or on Mars. So such sample return missions are probably the ultimate goal of any type of astrobiological exploration of the solar system, simply because we can apply many more techniques to solve this problem. We can combine a very sophisticated chemical analysis of the sample with, for example, a visual inspection with various different types of microscopy. This is something that is very difficult to do in situ. For example, using certain microscopes remotely on in situ probes is virtually impossible, while in Earth laboratory, it is actually much easier. So sample return is probably going to give us the ultimate proof. But in the meantime, we are actually hope to send all these private missions to the solar system bodies to actually get this intermediate data that will give us an important astrobiological results.
Shadow biospheres. And I'm actually going to broaden this question out than how it's normally presented. We think in terms of Earth and having a single abiogenesis, but maybe it has a second and we can't detect it. What happens if you go to Mars or Venus and find multiple abiogenesis? In other words, multiple microbes of completely different origins. What would that tell you about the natural history of Venus?
Oh, Venus or Mars or any planet. So that's a very difficult question to answer, because it depends how similar this alien life is biochemically and chemically to our own life. First of all, the shadow biosphere is some sort of a biosphere that doesn't have a common ancestor with our own biosphere here on Earth, our own predominant biosphere. So we all know that life on Earth is actually all related, and it had a common ancestor that survived at the onset of life on Earth. And we basically all are descendants of this life that survived. Now, the question is, do we have some additional life here on Earth, or do we have actually some other shadow biosphere somewhere on another planet, or can we have different biospheres that are completely separated from each other chemically? And the answer to that question is, of course, we don't know. But to prove that they are really completely unrelated from each other, we would have to have a very detailed comparison of biochemical machinery and chemistry that this life uses. And the level at which they are very different would tell us how likely they are to be completely unrelated. So, for example, if we have life that uses one single different nucleotide, so a letter in the genetic code, And apart from that, it's very similar biochemically. Is this actually a completely separate completely separate life that has a different origin from us? Well, it could be, but it is unlikely. It is more likely that it actually changed this nucleotide through the course of evolution for some evolutionary reasons, and that it actually is still related to the main life. And this is the example of this on Earth, of these special viruses that are called as cyanophage S2L, that instead of adenine, their genetic code, they have deaminopurine or aminoadenine, as they call it. So instead of letter A, they have a letter Z. And this could be called to a certain degree a shadow biosphere, because this is very difficult for us to detect such viruses, because our methods of detection are tailored to our own biochemistry and our own genetic material. But we know that because the rest of the biochemistry that this virus contains is the same as ours, that this virus is simply evolved this change of one letter to another later in the evolution, and it's not actually a completely separate branch of life. And can we have such a situation on Mars or some other planets? We don't know, but it might be. But I hope that we will have this problem to solve, because I hope that at some point through our exploration of the solar system, we actually have such a new field of science that is called a comparative astrobiology. For now, unfortunately, we have only one type of life here on Earth, and it is very difficult to extrapolate from this one type of life, our own Earth life, further into the chemical possibilities. So, for example, we cannot really model how life would really exist in some other environments, because we do not really know if our own life here on Earth is just a general or some specific manifestation of a very general phenomenon, or it is just the only way that life can exist with only this chemistry and nothing else is possible. We just don't know. So it is really crucial for us to have this second example, at least second example of some life, so we can compare. So we can compare this life on the chemical level and see how similar, and most importantly, what is different, because this gives us also the information how common really life is, and what are possible routes to its origin, and what can be changed, and what has to stay the same always.
Planets sneezing on each other, and I'm going to spin a scenario and shoot me down. So you have life occurring on, say, 3 planets in a star system, in our case, Mars, Earth, and Venus. And they all produced microbial life, and they were all getting hit with asteroids at the time that they produced it. Could a situation develop? Could it be envisioned that a situation develops where shadow biospheres are deposited in between planets in a system, and you end up with a situation where you have one type of life, an independent type of life, and say they're all water-based, assuming they would be, one type of life being deposited on another planet and then going into symbiosis with the abiogenesis that happened natively.
The symbiosis, so let's say that the life that gets deposited on a primordial planet or a moon that only is in the process of life's origin somehow incorporates this new arrival into its own biosphere. That's an interesting idea, and I don't know how likely it is. We could at the first glance naively say that it is unlikely, because origin of life here on Earth right now, 4.5 billion years after the formation of the planet, most certainly doesn't happen. And not only because the likely conditions, environmental conditions, are very different, like, for example, the oxygen-rich atmosphere that is a later product of our geological evolution, but also because life itself most likely is going to prevent any reactions that lead to origin of life. Because simply any kind of organics that are present in some environments that could react and lead to the formation of life would be used as food or building blocks for the existing life. So any life that originates faster or earlier in a solar system and gets deposited on a moon, on a planet that is actually habitable for that life, would likely take over the entire new habitat and possibly prevent this native origin of life from happening and stop it on its tracks, simply because it will start using these precious building blocks that the origin of life needs. So I don't really personally, and this is of course my own opinion, I don't believe once panspermia happens that this new planet that actually was hit by an asteroid carrying the originated life would somehow lead to a new origin of life, of its own native life, in concert with the separate biosphere. It is likely that such life transported through panspermia would dominate this environment, unless the native origin of life actually originates in an environment that cannot be somehow colonized easily by these new arrivals. But this is a highly speculative scenario. We know from our own life, our own Earth, so far at least, that all life that we have here is related to each other. And of course, people speculate about the shadow biosphere. It might exist, but it might not. But we have so far no conclusive evidence that it indeed exists.
It would be absolutely amazing if we discovered something like that, though, if we could devise a way to detect it. Can you imagine a way that we might broaden our ability to detect a shadow biosphere, not specialized towards our type of life, and actually look for it? I mean, what do we need to do to search Earth for a shadow biosphere?
Yes, that's a very good question. And it's also a very difficult topic scientifically, because many of our life detection techniques that we use here on Earth rely on the detection of specific biochemical solutions that our life evolved. So, for example, they use specific molecular techniques based, for example, on DNA sequencing or RNA sequencing of RNA or DNA. And in some cases, even more specifically, for example, sequencing of RNA genes. This is a highly specific way of detection of life. And it's in this case, for example, cellular life. So we are, in a sense, with our own technology, we are limiting ourselves in life detection. From that point of view, we need some sort of techniques that could, in principle, detect life in a sort of more agnostic way biochemically. And this is sort of what Dr. Janusz Petkowski is trying to do with his ALF instrument and the detector of the genetic polymers in general. But what we actually could try to do also is to simply search for complex organic chemistry and see what organic chemistry we actually detect. If we see some special patterns, let's say that we see more of certain chemicals or certain organics, and we do not see certain others, this could be an indication that we have some sort of chemical process that favors certain organics and doesn't favor others. And if we cannot ascribe any non-biological process to it, we could at least speculate and hypothesize that such preference in certain organics might be due to some activity of biological organisms. And an example of such scenario would be to detect various lipids. Like, for example, our own life prefers lipids that have even number of carbons in their lipid molecules. So we suddenly have, let's say that we go somewhere on a planet or on Mars or somewhere else, and we try to look for various organics. And we see organics of only special types, and only of, for example, lipids of certain size and not larger, not longer, not shorter, only with even number of carbons and not odd number of carbons and so on. This would be something that is quite peculiar because non-biological processes very rarely have such preferences. Such preferences exist because there is some sort of evolutionary pressure for life to have this preference. And non-biological processes, like, for example, some photochemical processes or geological processes that could process and react organic molecules, will not lead to such different ratios of organics. So if we actually try to look for some shadow biosphere, we could try to look for some peculiar organic chemistry that has some preference and at the same time is very different than the preferences that our own life has.
Many years ago, Carl Sagan described himself as a carbon chauvinist and originally a water chauvinist, but then he sort of said not so much later in life. Do you think carbon is where we need to be? Now, there aren't many chemicals that have the reactivity. You know, you're not going to find gold-based life or something like that just because of the nature of that atom. But in the case of carbon, what of silicon? And could we even devise, an experiment to try to detect silicon-based life on Venus or Mars?
Yeah, so silicon is often one of the more important tropes of science fiction. And in fact, I think that the most famous example of silicon-based life is from Star Trek. This is the organism Horta from the episode The Devil in the Dark. I think that this is an episode 20 6th or some season first, I think. But the problem with silicon is that it is sort of a false twin of carbon. It doesn't necessarily has it in principle it has this very similar way of building molecules as carbon does. It can have smaller molecules that have and also very large molecules that branch out also and form various polymers, just like carbon does. But the devil is like in the Star Trek episode, the devil is always in the details. In this case, the devil is in the reactivity of silicon. And silicon reactivity is dominated by its affinity to oxygen. So it very much likes to bind with oxygen. And once it reacts with oxygen, it forms this large polymeric structure, the meshwork rather than a linear polymer, that we call silica. So in other words, the silicon actually forms rocks. And this might be actually good for us, because if silicon didn't form rocks so efficiently with oxygen, then maybe we couldn't form planets as we form them right now. And hence we couldn't really form life that easily. So silicon, if it actually is used by life, and it is not really used that often on Earth and only in the context of silica, then it cannot be used as a substitute for carbon, because simply you cannot arrive at the same diversity of molecules to build life. And life itself, needs a sufficient chemical diversity. It needs sufficiently diverse chemicals to actually build itself and use it for various biological functions. So if you cannot, for example, build life only from hydrocarbons, because this would not give you sufficient chemical and biological function, and these molecules simply are not diverse enough to allow you for all the necessary biological functions. And if unfortunately silicon binds to oxygen so efficiently, then obviously this limits the available chemical diversity of molecules that silicon can build. This, of course, doesn't mean that silicon cannot be used by life at all. It can be used as a rare addition to biochemistry, for example, together with carbon in certain conditions. And our own research suggests that, for example, organosilicon molecules are relatively more stable, or more of them are stable in concentrated sulfuric acid than in water. So that's actually a pretty surprising result, but it looks like organosilicons actually might be, there are more of them, more diverse molecules that are stable in concentrated sulfuric acid than they are in water. This, of course, doesn't mean that life in concentrated sulfuric acid, if it hypothetically exists, would actually be using this silicon, because you still have to overcome this problem of actually mobilizing this silicon from silica and breaking these silicon-oxygen bonds that are so stable. But nevertheless, it doesn't mean that silicon is completely useless for life. It just means that it cannot be the scaffolding element. It cannot be the most important building, the central building of biochemistry, as carbon is.
Damn it, Jim, I'm a doctor, not a bricklayer. That was a truly classic Star Trek episode with the Horta that really fired my imagination when I first saw it in the 1980s in rerun. My last question for you is this. All right, antifreeze. So an environment where you have a mix of ammonia and water as the solvent of life, do you think that that's possibly even better than sulfuric acid? Do you think that that's maybe, a superior way to have life arise on ice shell moons, which seem to be common in the universe, if our solar system is any indicator?
It might be, if life can originate at the bottom of the ocean in hydrothermal vents, for example, then it might actually be that we can have life that is uniquely adapted to a solvent that is effectively a mixture of water and a high concentration of ammonia. This would be a cold environment, but not as cold as, for example, the seas of Titan, or methane seas of Titan. It will be still hot enough to actually facilitate various chemical reactions. So we can expect, especially in the farther reaches of the solar system, some conditions, like, for example, on various dwarf planets in the Kuiper belt, some conditions where you actually have the subsurface oceans that are effectively the mixtures of liquid water and liquid ammonia. And they are still hot enough to actually facilitate various interesting chemistry, and at the same time provide sufficient solubility for those potential organic molecules. This biochemistry, though, would have to be significantly different than our own biochemistry. And because many biochemicals that we have, various carbonyls, for example, that our life uses ubiquitously, would not really be a good solution in such an environment. We would have to have various biochemical polymers based mostly on imines rather than carbonyls and so on. But nevertheless, this might actually be a good solution for life as well. We just don't know if these conditions happen often enough. They might. Ammonia on its own cannot be really a promising solvent, especially on the surface of the planet, because ammonia in itself is quite a reactive molecule that gets very efficiently destroyed photochemically in the atmosphere. And when it actually gets photochemically destroyed, then it often reacts and forms nitrogen N2, and nitrogen N2 is spectacularly stable, and eventually, unfortunately, we are losing our liquid, we are losing our ammonia, and of course, without liquid, life unfortunately cannot function. So the mixture, but if the ammonia water ocean is protected by an ice shell further away from the central star, this actually might be an interesting solution, which is worth pursuing.
All right, Janusz, it was great talking to you again, and I look forward to talking to you again as things proceed with the Venus Life Finder mission.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Event Horizon and my channel are now available as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube memberships. Early ad-free episodes, bonus episodes, and sleep-focused content. Sign up now by clicking the links below to your platform of choice.